If you watch the news, you may have heard about the two earthquakes that shook Caracas recently. The first registered a 7.2 on the Richter scale. The second one hit even harder, a devastating 7.5. In this episode, I will talk about another natural disaster that happened near Caracas more than a quarter century ago and make some observations about both. These kinds of occurrences are often referred to as acts of God. I personally don't take that to mean that God is using his power to punish the wicked. I think it's simply a way to describe events which are difficult to foresee and often utterly impossible to shelter yourself from. In December of 1999, Venezuela was hit with days of relentless rain, which caused devastating floods and mudslides that killed thousands of its citizens. For those who don't know, something that I've mentioned in a couple of previous videos is that I lived in Caracas from 1981 to 2003. So I remember those floods. Of course, after 26 years, memories fade, and I did have to do some research to confirm many of the basic facts. Much of what I'm about to tell you comes from my own memories and the impressions that have remained with me over the years. Also, I want to point out that I'm not trying to make any larger political point or commentary here. Although I do make reference to some political events that happened at the time, basically, this is just a story that has been on my mind for years. At that time, I was living in an apartment in Parque Central, a large complex of 8 residential buildings, each roughly 40 stories high near downtown Caracas. My apartment was about halfway up the height of the building and faced due north. I had a great view of Avenida Bolívar, a wide street that led to the very center of the city. About a block beyond that, I could see the Bellas Artes metro stop on Avenida Universidad, and above it all was the magnificent Avila mountain range, which separated the capital from the Venezuelan coastline. I remember that rain as being somehow unusual. Let me explain. Caracas is no stranger to heavy tropical storms. As the crow flies, it's only about 10 miles from the Caribbean coast, so pretty much every year there would be violent storms that would drop several inches of rain in a matter of hours. And yes, the storms would cause damaging floods in some areas, and the saturated land under some houses would cause them to become unstable and collapse. Anyway, as I said, this rain was different. For one thing, I am hard-pressed to really describe it as a storm because it wasn't exactly stormy. There were no howling winds, no thunder, no lightning. The rain was pretty heavy, but not like the storms that dumped inches of rain in a couple of hours. The thing about this rain is that it simply wouldn't stop. The rain fell relentlessly for 3 solid days. I could imagine this as the kind of rain that the story of Noah's Ark was based on, if it had gone on for 40 days and nights. Sometimes I would watch from my window as the water washed down Avenida Bolívar. The water covered the width of the street, so it did look like a river. There was still a fair amount of traffic heading downtown, cars and buses driving against the current. Life goes on and people still have places they need to be. By the metro stop, I couldn't really see the water rushing down Avenida Universidad, but you could see water cascading from the streets perpendicular to the Avenida and from between the buildings that lined the street. The area beyond my view sloped upward towards the Avila, so the water naturally flowed downward into the city. Then, on the third night, I was surveying the scene from my window and saw that what had been water pouring down from north of the metro station had become mud. Not muddy water, but mud. Thick, free-flowing mud. There were still cars driving on Avenida Universidad, but soon they were unable to continue and everything stopped. Everything, that is, except the rain. By the time it finally ended, I would guess that there were 6 to 8 inches of mud by the metro station and even a couple of inches by Parque Central. That is what I remember seeing that night, but we were in an area where the impact was relatively light. There was a great deal of damage all over the city, but the worst devastation happened on the other side of the mountain. The state of Vargas, which lies between the Avila and the coast, was virtually wiped out. Entire towns and villages were swept away by what could best be described as a tsunami of mud. The death toll was hard to estimate because many of those who died lived in informal settlements where people put up houses with a few cinder blocks and tin roofs. Those places were often unrecorded and unacknowledged in official records. I remember hearing estimates of 50 to 300,000 dead, although now most sources say it was more likely up to 30,000. Of course, there's no way for me to know which figures are correct. But what I do know is that after years of cleanup, after rebuilding the new infrastructure necessary to remake Vargas into a functional state, out of the tens of thousands of people who lost their lives, only about 1,000 bodies were ever recovered. The rest were buried under untold layers of the newly redefined landscape, or they were simply swept into the ocean. I could go on forever recounting stories of the rare, miraculous rescues, or the heroic but tragic near rescues, and the apocalyptic images of the destruction around the country that were reported every day on TV and in the press. It took years for life to return to something resembling normal after the events of 1999. But now I want to shift my focus to another part of the same story, but which I see as something that ended up defining the political direction that Venezuela was to take for years to come. Hugo Chavez had been president for about 10 months when this tragic event occurred. A national referendum for a new constitution, which was a cornerstone of the Chavez campaign, was scheduled for the very day that mud buried the state of Vargas. On that day, Chavez was asked if he would postpone the referendum as the conditions in the country deteriorated at an alarming rate. He refused, instead reciting a quote by Simón Bolívar. Si la naturaleza se opone, lucharemos contra ella y haremos que nos obedezca. If nature stands in our way, we shall fight her and make her obey us. I'm not telling you this to blame the floods on the new government. I'm not sure what the new authorities could have done to mitigate the situation. There is nothing anyone could have done to stop the avalanche of mud that buried Vargas State. What impressed me wasn't simply that he refused to postpone the referendum. Passage of the Constitution was never seriously in doubt, no matter when the vote took place. It was the staggering hubris of Hugo Chavez, the idea that even a national catastrophe could not interrupt his political timetable. Many people believe that Chavez saw himself as the literal reincarnation of the Libertador, Simón Bolívar. I don't know what he really believed, but I can tell you this. The Libertador's personal sword had always been stored in a secure vault in the central bank, only to be brought out occasionally for display to the public. Hugo Chavez started taking the sword to public events, removing the weapon from its scabbard and waving it around as if to show how natural and comfortable it fit in his hand. Old-school military commanders and others were deeply offended by this and felt that it was grossly disrespectful. Here's the other thing that raised more than a few eyebrows at the time. In January, just a few weeks after the tragedy, the United States dispatched the USS Tortuga, which was loaded with heavy equipment and about 450 military engineers. Their task was to help clear and rebuild the highway along the coast. By that time, there was no way to access those areas except by helicopter, which could do little more than observe and report on the devastation, and perhaps to drop off some emergency supplies to the few survivors they managed to locate. Despite the fact that it was the Venezuelan government that requested the help in the first place, when the ship arrived, Chavez turned them away. He cited national sovereignty as the reason, saying he would never allow foreign soldiers on Venezuelan territory. Remember, Chavez hadn't been president for even a year. At that early stage, relations between the countries weren't especially strained. Chavez was critical of the U.S., but his discourse wasn't overly bellicose, and Venezuela still had very strong commercial ties with the U.S. But to me at the time, turning away critical help because it came from the U.S. government felt ominous. I have absolutely nothing to back up what I am about to say, so take it only as my personal impression. But I have always suspected that Fidel Castro, whom Chavez openly regarded as a mentor, may have persuaded Chavez to turn down the American offer. Venezuela desperately needed any help it could get, and it was their government that had requested the aid. Turning back that ship was a decision made with purely ideological considerations. To me, it had the feeling of something Castro would have advised. Whether that is true or not, I have no way of knowing. What I do know is that help was turned away and relations steadily deteriorated. What I found significant wasn't just that aid was turned away. The engineers were just going to help clear the highway. Nothing they could have done was going to save any lives at that point. I remember it because it seemed to portend a future where ideology would overshadow any practical concerns for the well-being of the Venezuelans. And I believe that instinct turned out to be largely true. The situation continued to deteriorate until reaching critical mass, which culminated with the arrest and removal of Nicolás Maduro earlier this year. This is a story I have wanted to tell for a while. And given the earthquakes that recently rocked Caracas, this seemed like a good time to do so. Natural disasters are not political, and the aftermath of such events should not be treated as such. Our government almost immediately sent search and rescue teams to the affected areas. We have sent our huge C-130 transport aircraft loaded with humanitarian aid and other support. Our military is even helping to restore the damaged runways and control tower at the country's main airport at La Guaira. It's a far cry from when Hugo Chavez turned our aid away. If you are so inclined, I would urge you to contribute to the relief fund of your choice. The Red Cross and Samaritan's Purse are a couple of organizations that come to mind. I shall put links to them in the description. One thing that has always made me proud of my country is that Americans are among the most charitable people in the world. And at this time, Venezuela can use our help, both through our prayers and through our pocketbooks. Thank you for watching. This is Pablo El Molinero. If you found this presentation interesting or informative, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, feel free to leave any comments you might have. If there is something you have to add to the story, or if something I said needs to be corrected. You can also just leave a comment to let us know what you think about the video. Something that would really help the channel is to share this video with anyone you think might enjoy it. Thanks again.